Elena's heart slammed against her ribs as she pressed her back against the cold stone wall, listening to the footsteps grow louder in the corridor outside. She had less than an hour before the guards changed shifts, and if she was still inside the Blackthorn compound when that happened, she would never leave it alive. Her hand rested on her stomach, protecting the small life growing inside her, a secret she had kept for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of hiding, of forcing herself to smile at council meetings, of pretending nothing had changed while everything had changed. She could not stay, not after what she had overheard the night before. She had been walking past the council chamber, carrying a tray of tea for the elders, when she heard her own name spoken in a tone that made her blood run cold. "The Elena girl is a complication," Lord Ashford had said, his voice low and precise, the way a man speaks when he has already decided something and is only working out the details. "If she is carrying what we suspect she is carrying, it cannot be allowed to reach the pack. Alpha Damien is meant for the Voss Alliance, nothing else. See that the matter is handled quietly, before it becomes something we cannot control." Elena had stood frozen in the hallway, the tray shaking in her hands, tea sloshing over the rim of the cups. She did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked away as calmly as she could manage, her mind racing through every terrible meaning those words could hold. Handled quietly. She knew exactly what that meant in a pack like Blackthorn. It meant an accident. It meant a story told afterward about a girl who simply disappeared one night, the way girls sometimes did when they became inconvenient to powerful men. She thought of Damien, the way his gray eyes had softened whenever he looked at her, the promises he had whispered in the dark of his private chambers, promises she had believed with her whole foolish heart. She still believed he loved her, but love had never been enough to protect an Omega from pack politics, and she was not willing to bet her child's life on the hope that it would be enough now. So she packed a single bag. She took only what she could carry without drawing suspicion, a few changes of clothes, the small amount of money she had saved from years of service in the kitchens, a photograph of her mother who had died when Elena was 16. She left behind everything else. The dresses Damien had given her, the silver bracelet with the Blackthorn crest, the life she had built in this place for the past 4 years. At midnight, when the compound was quiet except for the usual rotation of guards along the outer wall, Elena slipped out through the servants' entrance she had used 100 times before, carrying laundry baskets and delivering messages. Tonight she carried nothing but her bag and her fear. The forest beyond the compound was black and endless, but Elena knew it well. She had walked these paths since she was a child, gathering herbs with her mother, learning which routes avoided the patrol lines. She moved quickly, staying low, using every trick she had learned to keep her scent from carrying on the wind. Wolves could track by scent for miles, and if anyone realized she was gone before dawn, they would come looking. 3 miles from the compound, she stopped to catch her breath behind the wide trunk of an old oak tree, and that was when she heard it. A howl, low and mournful, rising from somewhere behind her. It was not a hunting call. It was something else. Something that sounded almost like grief, and for one terrible moment she wondered if it was Damien, if somehow he already knew she was gone. She pushed the thought away. There was no time for it. She had to keep moving. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances, Elena had reached the old highway that marked the edge of pack territory. She had never crossed this line before. Wolves rarely left their territories, and Omegas almost never did so alone, but she had no choice. Beyond this road was the human world, a place where scent trails grew confused among exhaust fumes and crowds, a place where a lone woman with a secret could disappear into the noise of ordinary life. She stood at the edge of the road for a long moment, looking back the way she had come, toward the forest that held everything she had ever known. Somewhere behind those trees was the man she loved, sleeping without any idea that his world was about to change, that the woman carrying his child had just walked out of his life to save it. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the wind, though there was no one to hear her. "I have to do this. For our baby." Then she turned and stepped onto the road, raising her hand as a truck approached in the distance. The driver, an older man with kind eyes and a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, slowed to a stop and rolled down his window. "You all right, miss? Bit early to be walking out here alone." Elena forced a smile onto her face, the same smile she had used for years to hide her true feelings from the pack. "I missed my ride. Could you take me as far as the city? I can pay. The driver studied her for a moment, taking in her tired eyes, and the single bag clutched against her chest, but he did not ask questions. Sometimes people simply understood that a person needed help and did not need to know why. Get in, no charge. It's not right. A young woman standing out here alone. Elena climbed into the passenger seat, and as the truck pulled away, she watched the forest shrink in the side mirror until it disappeared entirely behind a bend in the road. She did not know it then, but she would not see that forest again for 11 years. The drive took most of the day. The truck driver, who introduced himself as Walter, talked easily about his grandchildren and the weather, and nothing of any real importance, filling the silence in a way that Elena found strangely comforting. She answered when he asked questions, careful to keep her answers vague, and mostly she watched the landscape change outside the window. Forest giving way to farmland, farmland giving way to the first signs of a city rising on the horizon. When Walter finally dropped her at a bus station on the edge of a mid-sized city called Ridgemont, he pressed a folded bill into her hand before she could refuse it. For food, he said simply, "Take care of yourself, miss." Elena thanked him, and she meant it more than he could have known. It was the first act of kindness a stranger had shown her in a very long time, and it gave her a small flicker of hope that maybe, somewhere out in this vast unfamiliar world, she could build a life that did not depend on anyone's permission. Inside the bus station, she found a quiet corner and counted her money carefully. It was not much, but it would be enough to get her somewhere further away, somewhere with no connection to the Blackthorn territory at all. She studied the departure board, running her finger along the list of destinations, until she found a city name she did not recognize at all. A city called Ellsworth, 3 states away, a place where no wolf from her old life would ever think to look. She bought a ticket with the last of her cash and boarded the bus an hour later, taking a window seat near the back. As the bus pulled out of the station, Elena finally allowed herself to cry, quietly, her forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window. She cried for the life she was leaving behind, for the man she still loved, despite everything, for the fear of the unknown road ahead of her. But beneath the tears, there was something else too, something steady and unshakable. Determination. Whatever came next, she would protect this child with everything she had. The journey to Ellsworth took almost 2 days, with stops along the way that blurred together in Elena's exhausted memory. She slept in uncomfortable bus seats, ate whatever cheap food she could find at rest stops, and spoke to no one unless she absolutely had to. By the time the bus finally pulled into the Ellsworth station, she was running on nothing but nerves and the small, stubborn hope that she had made the right choice. Ellsworth was nothing like the forested territory she had grown up in. It was a real city, with tall buildings and busy streets, and more people in one block than she had seen in her entire life at Blackthorn. The noise of it was overwhelming at first. Car horns and distant sirens and the constant hum of 1,000 human conversations. But there was something freeing about it too. No one here knew her name. No one here knew what she was. She could be anyone she wanted to be. She found a small, run-down motel near the bus station and paid for one night with the last of Walter's gift money, promising herself she would find work the very next day. That night, lying on a lumpy mattress in a room that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, Elena placed her hand on her stomach and spoke softly into the darkness. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "I promise you, we're going to be okay." She did not know then how hard the coming months would be, how many doors would close in her face when landlords and employers grew suspicious of a woman with no family, no references, and no clear explanation for where she had come from. She did not know about the long nights she would spend working 2 jobs just to afford a single room, or the fear that would grip her every time a stranger looked at her son's eyes a little too long. She did not know, either, about the man who would search for her for years without ever giving up, refusing every arranged match his counsel pushed upon him, driven by a hope he could not explain even to himself. All Elena knew, in that quiet motel room on her first night of freedom, was that she had made a choice, and there was no going back from it now. Somewhere behind her, in a compound she would never see again, a man she loved would wake up in the morning and find her gone, and his world would shatter in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The next morning, Elena woke before dawn out of habit, an old instinct from years of rising early, to begin her duties in the Blackthorn kitchens. For a moment, lying in the unfamiliar motel bed, she forgot where she was. Then the memory of the last 2 days came rushing back, and with it, the weight of everything she now had to figure out alone. She showered quickly in the small motel bathroom, studying her reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. She looked tired, thinner than she remembered, with dark circles under her eyes that told the story of sleepless nights better than words ever could. But her eyes themselves were clear, focused, the eyes of a woman who had made a decision and intended to see it through. She checked out of the motel with the understanding that she needed to find somewhere more permanent and cheaper before her money ran out completely. She spent the morning walking the streets of Ellsworth, studying the notices posted in shop windows, the advertisements for rooms to rent, the help wanted signs taped to cafe doors. Most of the rentals were far beyond what she could afford, and most of the jobs required references or experience she simply did not have. By mid-afternoon, hungry and increasingly discouraged, she wandered into a small neighborhood on the edge of the city, quieter than the busy downtown streets, lined with older houses that had clearly seen better decades. It was there, on a cracked sidewalk in front of a modest brick house with peeling paint and a garden overflowing with flowers, that Elena met the woman who would change the course of her entire life. The woman was elderly, perhaps 70 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, and hands stained with soil from the garden she had been tending. She looked up as Elena passed, studying her with sharp, kind eyes that seemed to see far more than Elena wanted anyone to see. "You look lost, dear," the woman said, straightening up from her flower beds with a small groan. "And hungry, if I'm any judge." Elena managed a tired smile. "Just looking for a place to rent. I haven't had much luck yet." The woman studied her for a long moment, her gaze drifting briefly, almost imperceptibly, to the slight curve just beginning to show beneath Elena's loose shirt. If she noticed, she said nothing about it directly. "I have a room above my garage that I haven't used in years. It's small, but it's clean, and the rent is fair. Come inside first, though. You look like you could use a proper meal." Elena hesitated. She had learned, in her short time away from the pack, to be cautious of strangers who offered kindness too freely. But something in the old woman's eyes felt genuine, felt safe in a way Elena could not quite explain, and exhaustion finally won out over caution. "I'm Grace," the woman said, leading Elena up the porch steps and into a warm kitchen that smelled of fresh bread. "Grace Ellison. And you are?" "Elena," she answered, deciding in that instant to keep her own name at least, even if she would soon need to invent a new last name, a new history, a new version of herself for the world to see. "Elena Marsh." Grace nodded, setting a plate of bread and soup in front of her without another word, watching with quiet satisfaction as Elena ate like she had not eaten a proper meal in days. It was, in truth, closer to the truth than Elena wanted to admit. Over the following weeks, Grace became something Elena had never expected to find in this strange new city. A friend, a grandmother figure, the closest thing to family Elena had left in the world. She moved into the small room above Grace's garage, sparse but clean just as promised, and in exchange for reduced rent, she helped Grace with the garden and the housework that had grown difficult for the old woman's aging hands. Grace never asked prying questions about where Elena had come from, or why a young pregnant woman was living alone, with no family to speak of. She simply accepted Elena as she was, offering steady support without demanding explanations, and slowly, cautiously, Elena began to trust her. Elena found work at a small diner a few blocks from Grace's house, waiting tables during the lunch and dinner rush, for modest pay that nonetheless allowed her to begin saving, little by little, for the baby's arrival. The diner's owner, a gruff but fair man named Harold, did not ask too many questions either, simply grateful for a reliable employee who showed up on time and worked hard, despite her obviously growing exhaustion as the months passed. The pregnancy was not easy. Elena suffered through it largely alone, without the comfort of a mate beside her, without the medical care that pack healers might have provided, relying instead on Grace's practical wisdom and the care of a kind young doctor named Nathan Hale, who ran a small clinic near the diner and offered Elena a payment plan when she admitted, with quiet embarrassment, that she could not afford his full fees up front. Dr. Hale was observant in ways that occasionally worried Elena. During one appointment, listening to the baby's heartbeat. He had paused for a moment longer than necessary, a small frown crossing his face, before he smoothed it away, and said nothing more than that everything looked healthy and strong. Elena wondered, not for the first time, if he suspected something unusual about her, about the child she carried, but he never pressed the matter, and for that, she was deeply grateful. Through it all, in the quiet moments before sleep each night, Elena thought of Damien. She thought of his laugh, low and warm, the way he used to trace gentle patterns on her skin, in the dark hours before dawn, the promises he had made her believe, in a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. She wondered if he was searching for her, or if he had simply moved on, married to the Voss daughter as the council had always intended, already building a life that had no room left for her or the child she carried. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she had made her choice, and there was no use dwelling on a past she could never reclaim. But some nights, when the baby moved inside her and she pressed her hand gently against the spot, she could not help but wonder what Damien would think if he could see this moment, if he could feel the small, persistent kick of the child they had made together. She would never know, she told herself firmly. That part of her life was over now. All that mattered was the future ahead of her, and the small, fierce love already growing in her heart for the child she had not even met yet. 7 months after she had fled Blackthorn territory in the dead of night, Elena went into labor on a rainy autumn evening, with Grace by her side holding her hand through every difficult hour, and Dr. Hale guiding her through a delivery that left her exhausted but overjoyed. When the nurse finally placed her son in her arms, small and warm and impossibly perfect, Elena looked down into his tiny face and felt her heart nearly break with the force of her love for him. He had a full head of dark hair, just like his father, and even in those first newborn moments, Elena could already see hints of gray beginning to form in his eyes, the same striking gray that had first drawn her to Damien all those years ago. She traced a gentle finger along his small cheek and made him a silent promise, one she intended to keep for the rest of her life. "I'm going to protect you," she whispered, tears sliding freely down her face. "No matter what it takes, I will always protect you." She named him Kai, a name with no connection to the Blackthorn pack, no meaning that anyone from her old life would recognize. It was simply a name she had always loved, strong and simple, a name that belonged entirely to this new chapter of her life. As she held her son close in the quiet hospital room, listening to the soft rhythm of rain against the window, Elena allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that she and Kai were truly safe now, far away from Blackthorn territory and everything it represented. She had no way of knowing that the man she had left behind was, at that very same hour, standing alone on the balcony of his empty chambers, staring out at a moonless sky, refusing for the 3rd time that year to sign the marriage agreement his counsel had placed before him, driven by a grief and a hope he could neither explain nor release. Their paths had separated that night in the forest, but the story between them was far from over. It had only just begun. Damien stood in the council chamber, his hands braced against the long oak table, staring at the marriage contract that had been placed before him for the 4th time that year. His father's advisors, the men who had run Blackthorn affairs since before he was born, watched him with the patient, expectant looks of people who believed his refusal was only a matter of time. "Alpha Damien," Lord Ashford said smoothly, his voice carrying the same practiced calm it always held. "The Voss alliance strengthens our northern border. Every day this contract remains unsigned is a day our territory remains vulnerable. Surely you understand the weight of your responsibility." Damien lifted his gaze slowly, and something in his eyes made even Lord Ashford pause. It had been 11 weeks since Elena disappeared, 11 weeks of searching every corner of the territory, questioning every guard, every servant, every soul who might have seen her leave. No one had answers. She had simply vanished, as though she had never existed at all, and the not knowing was a wound that refused to close. "I understand my responsibility," Damien said quietly, "which is precisely why I will not sign a contract binding myself to a woman I do not love, while the woman I do love is missing, possibly in danger, and no one in this room seems the least bit concerned about finding her." A tense silence settled over the chamber. Several of the older council members exchanged glances that Damien did not miss, quick and guarded, the kind of glances shared by people who knew more than they were saying. He had noticed those glances before, in the days immediately following Elena's disappearance. and they gnawed at him constantly, a suspicion he could not quite prove, but could not shake either. Alpha Damien, another council member offered gently. It has been nearly 3 months. Perhaps it is time to consider that the girl left of her own will and does not wish to be found. Or, Damien said, his voice dropping low and dangerous, perhaps someone in this pack gave her a reason to run that had nothing to do with her own wishes. The room fell silent again, and this time no one offered a response at all. Damien studied their faces one by one, searching for any flicker of guilt, any tell that might point him toward the truth. He found nothing definitive, only the same careful, unreadable expressions the council always wore in matters of pack politics. He rolled the marriage contract closed without signing it, and left the chamber without another word, ignoring the frustrated murmurs that followed him out. He did not stop searching, not that week, not that month, not for years to come. He hired trackers who specialized in finding wolves who had gone into hiding among humans. He sent quiet inquiries to allied packs across the region, asking if anyone had encountered a young Omega woman traveling alone. He personally traveled to distant territories on the thinnest of rumors, chasing leads that led nowhere, returning each time more exhausted and no closer to an answer than before. His father, before he passed 2 years into the search, had once asked him gently why he refused to move forward with his life, why he clung so stubbornly to the memory of a servant girl who had disappeared without explanation. Damien had not been able to fully answer the question, not in words that made sense even to himself. All he knew was that something in his chest, something ancient and instinctive that ran deeper than logic, told him Elena had not left because she stopped loving him. Something had frightened her away, and until he understood what that something was, he could not let her go. As the years passed, the council grew increasingly impatient with his refusal to secure a political marriage, and increasingly bold in their attempts to pressure him. Proposal after proposal arrived from allied packs, each one accompanied by careful arguments about strengthening borders and securing bloodlines. Damien rejected every single one, a pattern that earned him a reputation among neighboring territories as a stubborn, perhaps even foolish, alpha king who prioritized sentiment over strategy. He did not care what they thought of him. He built Blackthorn into a stronger, more prosperous territory through sheer force of will and careful leadership, proving to anyone who doubted him that his personal choices did not weaken his ability to lead. But privately, in the quiet hours of the night, he still thought of Elena constantly, wondering where she was, whether she was safe, whether she ever thought of him at all. What he did not know, what he could not possibly have known, was that Elena had carried something away from Blackthorn that night that would one day bring their story full circle. A secret that Lord Ashford and his allies had tried desperately to bury, unaware that in forcing her to flee, they had only delayed the inevitable, not prevented it. 5 years after Elena's disappearance, a strange piece of information reached Damien through one of his most trusted trackers, a wolf named Silas, who had spent years quietly investigating the circumstances surrounding that night. Silas had uncovered evidence, carefully hidden financial records showing payments made from Lord Ashford's personal accounts to a group of mercenaries in the weeks before Elena vanished, payments that coincided suspiciously with rumors the mercenaries had been hired to eliminate a problem within the pack. Damien confronted Ashford directly, cornering him in his private study with the evidence spread across the desk between them. Ashford, cornered and unable to deny the paper trail, finally admitted the truth in halting, defensive sentences. He had learned of Elena's pregnancy before anyone else in the pack, and rather than risk the complication it posed to the Voss alliance, he had arranged to have the matter, as he put it, handled discreetly. Damien's control shattered in that moment, a rage unlike anything he had ever felt rising up through his chest. He understood now, with sickening clarity, exactly what had driven Elena away that night. She had not left because she stopped loving him. She had left because she was carrying his child, and someone in his own council had decided that child's life was worth nothing against political convenience. Ashford was stripped of his position and exiled from Blackthorn territory that same week, a punishment many considered merciful given the severity of what he had attempted. But the exile did nothing to ease the storm building inside Damien. Somewhere out in the world, possibly alive, possibly not, was a child of his blood, a child he had never known existed, born to a woman who had risked everything to protect that unborn life from the very pack meant to keep her safe. The search that had already consumed 5 years of his life took on a new, desperate urgency. Damien doubled his efforts, expanded his search beyond wolf territories entirely, and began looking specifically within human cities, reasoning that Elena would have hidden herself as far from pack awareness as possible. He hired human investigators alongside his wolf trackers, cast a wider net than ever before, driven now not only by love, but by the crushing weight of knowing his child might be out there somewhere, growing up without ever knowing where they truly came from. Years passed without a solid lead. Elena had covered her tracks well, changing cities more than once in those early years, out of an abundance of caution, careful never to stay anywhere long enough to be found. Damien began to fear, in his darkest moments, that he might spend the rest of his life searching for a family he would never find, chasing a hope that had slowly become the only thing keeping him tethered to a future he could otherwise no longer imagine. He never stopped believing, though. Not once, not even after 11 long years of silence. Something deep in his instincts, the same ancient pull that had once drawn him to Elena in the first place, told him that somewhere out there, his son was growing up strong, and that one day, against all odds, their paths would cross again. The fire alarm blared through the small apartment building at 3 a.m, and Elena bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding, before her mind had even fully registered what was happening. Smoke curled beneath her bedroom door, thin gray tendrils that seemed to thicken with every second she wasted, staring at them in confusion. "Kai!" she screamed, throwing herself out of bed and racing down the short hallway to her son's room. He was already awake, sitting up in bed with wide, frightened eyes, and Elena scooped him into her arms without a second's hesitation, ignoring the way her lungs already burned from the thickening smoke. They made it out of the building safely, joining a small crowd of neighbors gathered on the sidewalk across the street, watching in stunned silence as flames licked out of a second-floor window, not far from where their own apartment had been. It was later determined that a faulty wire in the building's ancient electrical system had sparked the blaze. An accident, nothing more. But the incident shook Elena badly. It was a stark, terrifying reminder of just how fragile the life she had built truly was. How quickly everything could be taken from her in an instant. That night, standing on the sidewalk with 4-year-old Kai wrapped in a blanket someone had handed her, watching firefighters battle the flames, Elena made a decision. It was time to move again, time to find somewhere more stable, somewhere she could build a real foundation for her son's future, instead of scraping by one uncertain month at a time. Grace, though heartbroken to see them go, understood completely. She had watched Elena grow from a frightened, exhausted young woman into a fiercely capable mother over the past 4 years, and she knew better than anyone that Elena's determination to protect Kai would always come first, above every other consideration. "You write to me," Grace insisted, tears in her eyes, as she hugged Elena tightly on the day they left Ellsworth for good, every month, at least. "And you bring that boy back to visit his old grandmother, Grace, whenever you can." Elena promised she would, a promise she kept faithfully for years to come, sending letters and photographs whenever she could afford the postage, updating Grace on every milestone in Kai's life, even from hundreds of miles away. Grace had become the closest thing to family Elena had left in the world, and she was determined never to let that bond fade, no matter how far they traveled. They settled eventually in a mid-sized coastal town called Brookhaven, chosen almost at random from a map, drawn by nothing more than the fact that Elena had never heard of it before, and reasoned that meant no one from her old life would think to look there either. It was a fresh start in every sense, and Elena threw herself into building a stable life for herself and her son, with a determination that bordered on relentless. She took night classes at a community college while working during the day, slowly earning a certification in bookkeeping that eventually allowed her to leave restaurant work behind entirely and take a steady office job with regular hours and, for the first time in her adult life, actual benefits. It was not glamorous work, but it was reliable, and reliable was worth more to Elena than any amount of glamour could ever be. Kai grew quickly, as children do, filling their small rented house with energy and questions and an insatiable curiosity about the world around him. From an early age, he displayed an unusual intensity that set him apart from other children his age, a sharpness in his gaze and a stillness in his body that sometimes unsettled adults who did not know him well. His teachers often remarked that he seemed older than his years, more perceptive, more thoughtful, as though he understood things other children simply could not grasp yet. His eyes drew the most attention, striking and gray, unusually pale against his dark hair and olive skin. They seemed almost to glow in certain lights, a trait that earned him both compliments and, occasionally, uncomfortable stares from strangers who could not quite place what made his gaze so unusual. Elena watched those moments carefully, every single time, her body tensing with an old, familiar fear, though she told herself repeatedly that ordinary humans could never truly recognize what they were seeing, not the way another wolf could. Still, she remained cautious in ways that sometimes puzzled her son as he grew older and began to ask more pointed questions. She kept him from certain activities that might draw too much public attention, discouraged him gently when his natural athleticism made him stand out too dramatically on the sports field, and grew anxious whenever unfamiliar adults lingered a little too long in conversation with him at school events. "Why do you always get that look on your face?" Kai asked her one evening when he was 7, sitting across from her at their small kitchen table while she helped him with his homework. "Like you're scared of something, when people talk to me?" Elena had been caught off guard by the directness of the question, so characteristic of her son, even at such a young age. She considered her answer carefully before speaking, choosing her words with the same care she always used when Kai asked questions that edged toward territory she was not yet ready to explain. "I just want to keep you safe," she said finally, reaching across the table to squeeze his small hand. "Sometimes mothers worry more than they need to. That's all." Kai had accepted the answer at the time, the way young children often accept incomplete explanations from parents they trust completely. But Elena knew, even then, that the day would come when such simple answers would no longer satisfy him. She had always known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that eventually she would have to tell him the truth about where he came from, about the heritage running through his blood that made him different from every other child at his school. She simply hoped she would have more time before that day arrived. As Kai grew older, entering his elementary school years, Elena began to notice other differences beyond his striking eyes and unusual maturity. He healed from minor injuries with unusual speed, a scraped knee closing almost overnight, a bruise fading within hours instead of days. His senses seemed sharper than other children's as well, able to hear conversations from across a room, able to pick out a single familiar scent in a crowded space. Elena watched these developments with a mixture of pride and deepening worry, aware that as he grew, controlling and concealing these traits would only become more difficult. She began, cautiously, to teach him small techniques for blending in, framing them as games rather than lessons in concealment. She taught him to moderate his reactions when startled, to avoid drawing attention to his heightened senses in front of others, to keep his more unusual abilities private, even from his closest friends. Kai absorbed these lessons quickly, perceptive enough even at a young age to sense that his mother's careful guidance carried a weight of seriousness beneath its playful presentation. By the time Kai turned 9, Elena had built a comfortable, stable life for the two of them in Brookhaven. She had earned a promotion at her office job, saved enough to move them into a small but genuinely nice rental house with a backyard where Kai could run and play, and formed a small circle of trusted friends who knew her as a hard-working single mother with no complicated past to speak of. It was, by any reasonable measure, a good life, one built entirely through her own determination and sacrifice. But peace, Elena had learned long ago, rarely lasted forever, especially not for someone carrying the kind of secret she carried. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a stranger who appeared at Kai's school one autumn afternoon, asking careful, probing questions of the front office staff about enrollment records and family histories. Questions that raised enough suspicion among the school administrators that Elena received a concerned phone call that same evening. "Just wanted to give you a heads up," the school secretary said cautiously. "Some man came by asking about students, said he was doing research for a genealogy project, but honestly, it felt a little strange to me. I didn't give him any information, of course, but I thought you'd want to know." Elena's blood ran cold as she listened, her mind racing back instantly to Blackthorn, to Lord Ashford's threats all those years ago, to every fear she had carried with her since the night she fled the pack. She thanked the secretary for the warning, and hung up the phone with trembling hands, staring across the living room to where Kai sat innocently doing his homework, completely unaware of the danger that might once again be circling closer to their carefully built life. That night, after tucking Kai into bed, Elena sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, slowly going cold in her hands, turning the same worried thoughts over and over in her mind. Had someone finally found them? Was this connected to Blackthorn at all? Or was she simply allowing old fears to color an innocent, if strange, incident? She had no way to know for certain, and the uncertainty itself felt like its own kind of torment. Over the following weeks, Elena remained hyper-aware of her surroundings, watching for unfamiliar faces lingering near the school, studying every new person who entered her life with cautious suspicion. Nothing further happened. No more strange visitors, no more probing questions, and eventually, the sharp edge of her fear dulled into a quieter, more manageable background worry, the kind she had learned to live with for most of Kai's life. She never discovered, in those years, that the man who had visited Kai's school was not connected to Blackthorn at all, but rather one of the many private investigators Damien had hired over the years, following a thin lead that ultimately went nowhere, one dead end, among dozens he had chased across the country, in his relentless search for the family he did not yet know he had found. Life continued in Brookhaven, with a fragile, hard-won stability, Elena building her career, Kai growing into an increasingly remarkable young boy, both of them settling into a rhythm that felt, for the first time in years, almost like genuine peace. But even as that peace held, the world beyond their quiet coastal town continued turning, and somewhere far away, a search that had never truly stopped, continued closing the distance between them, one small step at a time. By the time Kai turned 12, he had grown into a lean, quick young boy whose natural athleticism made him a standout on his school's soccer team, despite his mother's persistent, gentle attempts to keep his talents from drawing too much attention. He scored goals with an instinct that seemed to border on supernatural, moving across the field with a speed and precision that left coaches from rival schools asking his own coach, half joking, whether the boy had been training since before he could walk. Elena watched every game from the sidelines with a familiar knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach, torn between genuine pride in her son's achievements and the constant, exhausting need to monitor how much of himself he was revealing to the world around him. After one particularly impressive match, in which Kai had scored 3 goals and set up 2 more, with what several parents in the stands openly called superhuman speed, Elena pulled him aside on the walk home. "You did amazing today," she said carefully, choosing her words as they always required careful choosing on this particular subject. "But sweetheart, maybe ease up just a little next game. Let some of the other boys have their moments too." Kai glanced at her sideways, 12 years old but already sharp enough to read the deeper worry beneath her casual tone. "You mean don't show off how fast I am?" "I mean," Elena said gently, "that some things about you are special, in ways other people might not understand. And it's better if we're careful about how much we let people see. That's all." It was not the first time she had given him some version of this warning, though it was perhaps the most direct she had ever been about it. Kai had grown increasingly perceptive over the years, and Elena knew, with a certainty that filled her with both dread and a strange kind of relief, that the day was rapidly approaching when vague warnings would no longer satisfy him. That day arrived sooner than she expected, on a quiet evening several months later, when Kai came home from school with a torn shirt and a scraped elbow, the result of a fall during recess that should have left him limping in pain for at least a few days. Instead, by the time Elena got home from work that evening, the scrape had already faded to nothing more than a faint pink line, and Kai moved without any sign of discomfort at all. He sat across from her at the dinner table that night, pushing food around his plate without really eating, his expression uncharacteristically troubled. Elena noticed immediately, setting down her own fork to give him her full attention. "Something on your mind?" Kai was quiet for a long moment, clearly working up the courage to voice whatever question had been building inside him. "Mom," he said finally, "why do I heal so fast? Danny fell off the monkey bars last week, and he's still got a bruise. I fell way harder today, and there's basically nothing left." Elena's heart clenched painfully in her chest. She had known this moment was coming, had rehearsed variations of this exact conversation in her mind, more times than she could count. But faced with her son's earnest, searching gaze, every carefully prepared explanation suddenly felt inadequate. "That's a really good question," she said slowly, buying herself a moment to gather her thoughts. "How about we talk about it properly this weekend? Just the 2 of us. It's not a simple answer, and I want to give you the real one, not a rushed version at the dinner table." Kai studied her carefully, clearly sensing the significance of what she was promising, but he nodded, willing to wait. The same patient trust he had always shown his mother, even when her explanations felt incomplete. That Saturday, Elena took Kai to a quiet park a short drive from their house, choosing a bench far from other visitors where they could speak without fear of being overheard. She had spent the entire week preparing for this conversation, writing and rewriting explanations in her head, trying to find the right balance between honesty and the careful protection she had built their entire lives around. "What I'm about to tell you," she began, once they were settled, "is going to sound impossible, but I need you to trust me, and I need you to listen all the way through, before you ask questions, okay?" Kai nodded solemnly, and Elena took a steadying breath before continuing. She told him everything, or nearly everything. She explained that their family carried an ancient bloodline, one connected to a hidden world most humans never knew existed, a world of pacts and territories governed by their own laws and traditions. She explained, as gently as she could, that his father belonged to a powerful family within that world, a family whose politics had made it too dangerous for Elena to stay, once she learned she was carrying Kai. She spoke of the threat that had driven her away, careful not to name Lord Ashford directly, focusing instead on the broader danger, rather than specific details that might frighten him more than necessary. She did not tell him his father's name. Not yet. She told herself it was to protect him, that the knowledge would only complicate his already difficult adjustment to this new understanding of himself. But some quiet part of her also recognized a different truth. Speaking Damien's name out loud, after 11 years of silence, felt like reopening a wound she had spent over a decade trying to heal. Kai listened to the entire explanation without interrupting, his young face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and finally something that looked almost like relief, as though pieces of a puzzle he had been quietly assembling his entire life had finally clicked into place. "So I'm not human," he said slowly, once she had finished. "Not all the way." "You're still you," Elena said firmly, reaching over to take his hand. "Everything that makes you who you are, your kindness, your curiosity, the way you always look out for your friends, none of that changes. This is just another part of who you are, one you needed to understand, so you can learn to handle it safely." "Can I do more than heal fast?" Kai asked, his scientific curiosity already beginning to override his initial shock. "Like, will I be able to do other things when I get older?" Elena hesitated, aware that this part of the conversation would require even more careful navigation. "As you get older, yes, other changes might happen. I'll teach you everything I know, and we'll figure out the rest together. But Kai, this has to stay completely private. Do you understand? No friends, no teachers, no one outside this family can ever know. It's the only way to keep you safe." Kai absorbed this instruction with the same serious gravity he seemed to apply to everything genuinely important in his young life, and he promised, with quiet sincerity, to keep their secret exactly as she asked. It was a promise he would hold to faithfully over the following years, carrying the weight of his unusual heritage, with a maturity that continued to both amaze and worry his mother in equal measure. In the months that followed their conversation at the park, Elena began teaching Kai, slowly and carefully, techniques for managing and concealing the traits that made him different. She taught him breathing exercises to calm the occasional overwhelming rush of heightened senses, taught him to consciously moderate his speed and strength during sports and physical activities, taught him small habits of discretion that would serve him for the rest of his life. Kai proved to be a remarkably quick study, absorbing each lesson with the same intense focus he brought to everything he cared about. Their bond, already close, deepened further through this shared secret. Kai began to understand, in ways he had not fully grasped as a younger child, just how much his mother had sacrificed to keep him safe, how many years of careful vigilance and quiet fear had gone into building the stable, ordinary-seeming life he had always taken somewhat for granted. He found himself watching her with new appreciation, noticing details he had previously overlooked, the careful way she always positioned herself near exits in unfamiliar places, the practiced ease with which she deflected personal questions from new acquaintances, the quiet strength that had carried them both through 11 years of careful hiding. "Do you think he ever thinks about us?" Kai asked one evening, several weeks after their initial conversation, catching Elena off guard as she washed dishes at the kitchen sink. "My father, I mean. Do you think he wonders if he has a kid somewhere?" Elena's hands stilled in the soapy water for a long moment before she found her voice. "I don't know," she admitted honestly, turning to face her son. "I think about that too, sometimes. But it doesn't change anything about our life here. We're safe, we're together, and that's what matters most." Kai nodded, accepting the answer even though Elena could see, in the thoughtful crease of his young brow, that the question had not fully settled in his mind. She understood, with a mixture of dread and inevitability, that this would not be the last time her son asked about the father he had never known. As he grew older, the questions would only become more pointed, more difficult to deflect with careful, incomplete answers. She was not wrong to worry. Somewhere out in the world, unbeknownst to either of them, the search for that missing family was drawing steadily closer, guided by persistence, instinct, and a father's unbreakable determination to find the child he had spent more than a decade searching for, without ever once giving up hope. 11 years of searching had taught Damien to expect disappointment. Every lead his trackers uncovered eventually crumbled into nothing. Every promising rumor evaporated under closer investigation. Every hopeful trail went cold within weeks or months. He had learned, through painful repetition, not to let his hopes rise too high with each new piece of information, a defense mechanism against the crushing weight of yet another failed search. So when Silas approached him one gray winter morning with a folder of new information, Damien accepted it with the same careful, guarded skepticism he had developed over more than a decade of dead ends. "This one feels different," Silas said, setting the folder on Damien's desk with unusual gravity in his voice. A woman matching Elena's description was seen boarding a bus out of a city called Ridgemont, roughly 11 years ago, shortly after the time frame we believe she left Blackthorn. "I finally managed to track the driver who gave her a ride to the station. He remembered her clearly, said she seemed frightened, alone, carrying almost nothing." Damien's hands stilled over the folder, an old, familiar tightness gripping his chest. 11 years is a long trail to follow from a single bus ticket. "There's more," Silas continued. "The ticket was purchased for a city called Ellsworth. I've already sent people to investigate, quietly, without drawing attention. If she settled there, even briefly, someone will remember her. A pregnant woman traveling alone tends to leave an impression on people, even years later." Damien opened the folder and studied the details Silas had compiled, a hand-drawn timeline connecting fragments of evidence that had taken years of patient investigation to assemble. It was the most concrete lead he had received since the search began, and despite every hard-learned instinct telling him not to hope too much, he felt something shift in his chest, a cautious, fragile spark of possibility he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. "Keep investigating," he said finally, closing the folder with careful, deliberate hands. "Quietly, I don't want word of this reaching the council until we have something certain." The council, in the years since Ashford's exile, had grown somewhat more sympathetic to Damien's continued search, though many still privately believed it was a fool's errand, a distraction from the more pressing matters of pack governance. Damien had long since stopped caring what they believed. His authority as Alpha King was secure, his leadership respected even by those who questioned his personal choices, and he had built enough political capital over the years to pursue his search without significant interference. Silas's investigation in Ellsworth took several more weeks, patient work that involved tracking down old employment records, interviewing longtime residents, following the faintest threads of memory that most people had long since forgotten. Eventually, that patience paid off in the form of an elderly woman named Grace Ellison, who still lived in the same modest brick house on the edge of the city, tending the same overflowing garden she had kept for decades. Silas approached her carefully, introducing himself as a private investigator, working on behalf of a family, trying to reconnect with a lost relative, a version of the truth vague enough to avoid revealing too much, while still, hopefully, encouraging cooperation. Grace, sharp-eyed and cautious even in her advanced age, studied him for a long moment before responding. "I don't know what business is bringing you to my doorstep," she said carefully, "but I've had a young woman living under my roof once, many years ago, who left a very different life behind her. If you're here to cause her trouble, you can turn right back around." "I promise you, that's not my intention," Silas said, choosing his words with care. "I represent a man who has spent 11 years searching for a woman named Elena and the child she may have been carrying when she left her previous home. He only wishes to know they're safe, nothing more." Grace's expression shifted subtly at the mention of Elena's name, a flicker of recognition she could not quite hide, despite her evident caution. She studied Silas for a long, considering moment, weighing something in her mind that Silas could not fully read. Elena did live with me, she admitted finally. Many years ago now. She had a son, a beautiful boy named Kai. But I won't tell you where they are now, unless I have some real assurance this isn't going to bring them harm. That girl ran from something terrible once. I won't be the reason it catches up to her again. Silas returned to Blackthorn with this information, and Damien, upon hearing it, insisted on traveling to Ellsworth himself, reasoning that Grace deserved to meet him directly, to judge his character and his intentions with her own eyes, rather than relying solely on a stranger's assurances. It was a decision that surprised even his most loyal advisors, an Alpha King personally traveling into human territory on the strength of a single promising lead. But Damien had waited 11 years for exactly this kind of opportunity, and he had no intention of delegating it to anyone else. He arrived at Grace's modest brick house on a crisp spring afternoon, dressed in plain, unremarkable clothing, meant to avoid drawing attention, and knocked on her door with a nervousness he had not felt in years. Grace answered, studying him carefully through narrowed, assessing eyes, taking in every detail of his appearance, with the sharp scrutiny of a woman who had clearly spent a lifetime learning to read people accurately. "You must be the one Elena ran from," she said finally, though there was less accusation in her tone than simple, careful observation. "Or the one she ran to protect herself from someone else entirely. Which is it?" "The second," Damien said quietly, standing on her porch with a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to display, even among his own people. "I never wanted her to leave. I didn't even know why she had until very recently. I've spent 11 years searching for her, and the child I only learned existed a few years into that search." Grace studied him for a long, silent moment, and whatever she saw in his expression, whatever quiet, aching sincerity she read in his eyes, seemed to settle something in her mind. She stepped back from the doorway, gesturing him inside with a small, resigned sigh. "Come in, then. I suppose you'd better sit down. I've got a great deal to tell you, and you look like a man who's waited long enough to hear it." Over the following hour, seated at Grace's kitchen table, with a cup of tea slowly cooling before him, Damien listened as she recounted everything she knew of Elena's years in Ellsworth, the fear that had haunted her in those early months, the fierce determination with which she had built a life for herself and her son, the eventual decision to move on to a new city years earlier, seeking greater stability. Grace did not know exactly where Elena had settled since then, their correspondence limited to occasional letters that arrived without a consistent return address, Elena's own careful precaution against exactly this kind of tracing. But Grace did have something Damien desperately needed. A collection of old photographs, sent to her over the years as Kai grew, documenting birthdays and school events and small ordinary moments of a childhood Damien had missed entirely. She retrieved a worn shoebox from a closet and set it carefully on the table between them, watching Damien's face closely as he opened it with trembling hands. The first photograph he lifted from the box showed a young boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, grinning widely at the camera on what appeared to be a birthday celebration, missing one front tooth, his dark hair falling messily across his forehead. But it was the boy's eyes that stopped Damien's breath entirely, striking, unmistakable gray eyes that were, in every essential way, an exact mirror of his own. "That's him," Damien said, his voice rough with an emotion he could barely contain. "That's absolutely him. I would know those eyes anywhere." Grace watched him carefully as he continued sorting through the photographs, each one revealing another small piece of the son he had never known. A school photograph, a snapshot from a soccer game, a candid moment of Kai laughing with his mother in what looked like a backyard somewhere. Damien studied each image with the desperate hunger of a man trying to memorize 11 years of missed moments all at once, his hands shaking, his throat tight with a grief and a joy so intertwined he could barely separate the two feelings. "She kept these hidden from you all these years," Grace said gently, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. "Whatever drove her from that place you both came from, it scared her badly enough to give up everything familiar rather than risk her son's safety. If you truly love them both the way you say you do, you'll remember that when you find them. Whatever anger or hurt you're carrying, set it aside for their sake." Damien nodded, unable to speak for a long moment, as he studied the last photograph in the box. A more recent one, showing a boy who looked perhaps 10 or 11, taller now, his features sharpening into something that hinted at the young man he would eventually become. But those eyes remained unmistakably, unchangeably his own. "I don't have any anger toward her," Damien finally managed to say. "Only regret that I couldn't protect her from whatever forced her to run in the first place. I only want the chance to make things right, if she'll allow it." Grace studied him a moment longer, then reached across the table and patted his hand with the kind of gentle, knowing gesture only a woman of her years and experience could offer. "Then I hope for both their sakes that you find them. That boy deserves to know where he comes from, and Elena deserves to stop running. 11 years is a long time to carry a burden like that alone." Damien left Ellsworth that evening with copies of several photographs carefully preserved in his coat pocket, and a renewed, burning determination to finish what had become the singular mission of his adult life. He did not yet know where Elena and Kai currently lived, only that they existed, that his son was real, growing and thriving somewhere out in the wider world, waiting, without even knowing it, for a father who had never once stopped searching for him. The search that had once felt like chasing shadows now had a clear, undeniable purpose, and Damien returned to Blackthorn territory with an energy and focus he had not felt in years, determined that whatever remaining distance separated him from his family, he would close it, no matter how long it took or how far he had to travel to do it. 2 more years passed before the trail Damien had picked up in Ellsworth finally led somewhere concrete. Silas and his team traced Elena's movements through a careful reconstruction of scattered records, old rental agreements, employment histories, the kind of ordinary paper trail that most people never think twice about, but that, pieced together with enough patience, could tell a remarkably detailed story. Eventually, that trail led to a small coastal town called Brookhaven, where a woman matching Elena's description had been employed at a local accounting firm for the past several years. Damien received the news on a quiet evening in early autumn, 13 years almost to the month since Elena had disappeared from Blackthorn. He read Silas's report twice through, his hands steady this time, in a way they had not been during earlier false leads, a calm certainty settling over him that this, finally, was the real thing. "I want to see them myself," he said, setting the report down carefully. "Not trackers, not investigators. Me." Silas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Alpha Damien, if I may suggest caution, 13 years is a long time. She built an entire life believing she needed to hide from us. Approaching too directly, too suddenly, could frighten her, or worse, cause her to run again, before you have the chance to explain everything that's changed." Damien considered this warning seriously, aware of the wisdom in it, even as every instinct in him wanted nothing more than to travel immediately to Brookhaven and find them both. "Then help me find the right way to approach it, something careful, something that gives me a chance to see them, even briefly, without immediately upending whatever life she's built." Silas nodded, already turning the problem over in his mind. Within days, he had identified a plausible opportunity, a regional business conference scheduled to take place in Brookhaven the following month, an entirely legitimate reason for Damien to travel to the coastal town without raising any unusual suspicion. Damien's pack maintained substantial business interests across several industries as part of its broader economic strategy, and attending such conferences was, in fact, a routine part of his responsibilities as Alpha King. The weeks leading up to the conference passed with an agonizing slowness for Damien, each day bringing him closer to a moment he had imagined countless times over 13 long years, yet still felt entirely unprepared to actually face. He found himself lying awake at night, rehearsing possible conversations, imagining Elena's reaction upon seeing him again, wondering what his son might look like now, grown into a young teenager he had never had the chance to know. He arrived in Brookhaven 3 days before the conference officially began, using the extra time to quietly familiarize himself with the town, walking its streets, studying its rhythms, resisting the powerful urge to immediately seek out Elena's address, which Silas's investigation had already confirmed. He told himself he wanted to approach this carefully, thoughtfully, but in truth, a part of him was simply afraid that after everything, after 13 years of searching, the reality of seeing her again might somehow fall short of the hope that had sustained him for so long. It was on the second evening of his stay, during a quiet walk along Brookhaven's small downtown district, that fate intervened in a way Damien could never have planned or predicted. He had stopped outside a small community center, drawn by the sound of cheering coming from within, curious about the source of such energetic enthusiasm on an otherwise quiet weekday evening. Stepping inside, he found himself at the edge of a youth soccer awards banquet, a modest gathering of families celebrating the end of a local league season, folding tables set with simple decorations, proud parents chatting while their children darted between tables in the restless energy typical of young athletes, still riding the excitement of a successful season. Damien moved to leave, aware that he was intruding on what was clearly a private community event, but something stopped him before he had taken more than a few steps toward the door. Across the room, seated at a table near the front where trophies were being distributed, a boy stood to accept an award, and the moment Damien's gaze landed on him, every other sound in the room seemed to fade into silence. The boy was perhaps 13 years old, tall for his age, with dark hair and an easy, confident bearing as he crossed the room to accept his trophy. But it was his eyes that made Damien's entire body go still, striking, unmistakable gray eyes that Damien had seen in mirrors his entire life, eyes that were, without any possible doubt, his own. Damien's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain everyone in the room must be able to hear it. He stood frozen near the entrance, unable to move, unable to look away from the boy, who could only be his son, watching as Kai laughed at something the league coordinator said, watching the easy, natural way he interacted with his teammates, seeing in every small gesture and expression traces of both himself and, unmistakably, Elena. And then, as though some ancient instinct had alerted her to his presence, a woman seated near the front of the room turned slowly, scanning the crowd until her gaze landed directly on Damien, standing near the entrance. Elena's face, 13 years older but still achingly familiar, went completely pale, her entire body freezing in place as recognition swept across her features. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved, the noise and celebration of the banquet continuing around them, entirely oblivious to the seismic reunion unfolding in their midst. Elena's eyes, wide with shock, searched Damien's face, as though trying to confirm what her own senses were telling her could not possibly be true, that after 13 years of careful hiding, of building an entire life around the fear of exactly this moment, the man she had fled had somehow found them anyway. Damien took a slow, careful step forward, his hands raised slightly in a gesture meant to convey he intended no threat, his eyes never leaving hers even as every instinct in him screamed to look instead at the boy still standing near the front of the room, accepting congratulations from his teammates, with no idea that his entire world was about to change forever. "Elena," Damien said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the noise of the celebration, though somehow she heard him perfectly across the crowded room. "Please, I'm not here to hurt you. I just need to talk to you." Elena's hands trembled visibly at her sides. 13 years of careful vigilance and hard-won safety, suddenly feeling as fragile as glass in the face of this impossible reunion. Every instinct that had kept her running, kept her hiding, kept her son safe for over a decade, screamed at her to gather Kai immediately and disappear, to protect what she had built with the same fierce determination that had guided every decision she had made since that terrifying night at Blackthorn. But another instinct, one she had suppressed for 13 long years, one she had told herself was buried beneath layers of fear and necessary caution, rose up unexpectedly in that moment, as she looked at Damien's face, older now, lined with a weariness she recognized as the physical toll of a search she was only beginning to understand the depth of. It was the same instinct that had once drawn her to him in the first place, the same bond that had never truly faded despite 13 years of forced separation. "How did you find us?" she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, though the question carried the weight of every fear she had carried since the night she fled. "It's a long story," Damien said, taking another careful step closer, close enough now that he could see the fine lines of worry etched around her eyes, evidence of years spent in constant, careful vigilance. "But I promise you, Elena, I'm not here because of anything you fear. Ashford is gone, exiled years ago, once I learned what he did, what he threatened. I've spent 13 years searching for you both because I never stopped loving you, and because I only recently learned that I have a son." Elena's composure finally cracked at those words, tears filling her eyes, as 13 years of accumulated fear, exhaustion, and carefully suppressed longing rose to the surface all at once. Across the room, unaware of the profound conversation unfolding near the entrance, Kai laughed at something one of his friends said, his trophy held proudly in his hands, entirely unaware that the father he had wondered about for years, the father whose existence he had only recently learned to understand, stood watching him from across the room, with an expression of overwhelming, aching love. "He doesn't know," Elena whispered, following Damien's gaze toward their son. "He knows about our heritage, about what he is, but he doesn't know your name, doesn't know anything about you specifically. I wanted to protect him from all of it, at least until he was old enough to understand fully." "I understand," Damien said gently, though the words cost him a visible effort. "I'm not asking you to change anything tonight. I only need you to know that I'm here, that I've been searching, and that whatever happens next, I want it to happen in whatever way is safest and best for him. For both of you." Elena studied his face for a long, searching moment. 13 years of hard-won independence and careful self-reliance, warring visibly with the deep, unresolved feelings his sudden appearance had stirred back to the surface. Finally, she gave a small, uncertain nod, glancing once more toward Kai, before returning her attention to Damien. "Not here," she said quietly. "Not tonight. With him right there. Give me your number. I'll call you tomorrow, and we can talk properly, somewhere private, without him overhearing anything, until I've had a chance to prepare him." Damien agreed immediately, writing his contact information on a small notepad he retrieved from his pocket, with hands that were not entirely steady. As he handed it to her, their fingers brushed briefly, and something passed between them in that small, simple contact. 13 years of separation compressed into a single charged moment neither of them fully understood how to process. "Thank you," Damien said quietly, "for keeping him safe. For everything you sacrificed to protect him. I know now what you were running from, and I know I can never fully make up for the years we lost. But I intend to try, if you'll let me." Elena nodded once more, then turned and made her way back toward Kai, who greeted her with an easy smile, completely unaware of the conversation that had just taken place, of the way his mother's entire world had just shifted on its axis in the span of a few short minutes. Damien watched them for a moment longer, memorizing the sight of his son laughing, safe and happy, before he turned and quietly left the banquet, stepping out into the cool evening air, with his heart pounding, and his mind racing with everything that had just happened, and everything still left to come. Elena did not sleep at all that night. She lay awake in her bed, long after Kai had gone to sleep in his own room down the hall, staring at the ceiling, as 13 years of carefully suppressed memories and emotions rose to the surface all at once, refusing to be pushed back down. Every fear she had carried since fleeing Blackthorn, every quiet longing she had never fully admitted even to herself, every unanswered question about the life she had left behind, all of it crashed over her in overwhelming waves throughout the long, sleepless night. By morning, she had made her decision. She would meet with Damien, hear him out fully, and decide from there how to proceed, carefully, deliberately, with Kai's well-being as her only true priority. She called the number he had given her shortly after dropping Kai off at school, her hands trembling slightly as she dialed, 13 years of distance somehow collapsing the moment she heard his voice answer on the second ring. "Elena," he said, and even that single word carried an entire history between them, relief and longing and careful restraint, all woven together in the way he spoke her name. "There's a coffee shop near the marina," she said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. "Meet me there in an hour. We need to talk before I decide anything about how, or whether, to involve Kai in this." Damien agreed immediately, and an hour later, they sat across from each other at a small corner table, 2 cups of coffee cooling untouched between them, as 13 years of separation finally found their voice in a long, difficult, deeply emotional conversation. Elena told him everything, the overheard conversation in the council chamber, the terror that had driven her to flee that very night, the difficult years of building a life from nothing, the constant vigilance required to protect Kai's secret and, by extension, his safety. Damien, in turn, told her about Ashford's exile, about the financial records Silas had uncovered proving the threat had been real and deliberate, about 13 years of relentless searching that had never once wavered, despite countless dead ends and false leads. He told her about every marriage proposal he had refused, every counsel pressure he had withstood, every lonely night spent wondering if he would ever find the family he had lost before he even knew they existed. "I should have told you I suspected something," Elena admitted, tears sliding down her face as she spoke. "I should have trusted you enough to come to you directly, instead of running. But I was so afraid, and I didn't know who else in the pack might have been involved. I only knew I had to protect our baby, whatever it took." "You made the right choice," Damien said firmly, reaching across the table to take her hand, a gesture she allowed after only a brief hesitation. "You kept him safe when the very people who should have protected you both failed completely. I will never fault you for the choice you made that night. I only wish I could have found you sooner, spared you so many years of struggling alone." They talked for hours that morning, working through 13 years of separation, grief, and unresolved feelings, slowly rebuilding a foundation of trust that had been shattered by circumstances neither of them had fully controlled. By the time they finally rose from the small corner table, something had shifted between them, not a full restoration of what they once had, but a genuine, cautious beginning toward something new. "I want to meet him properly," Damien said as they stood outside the coffee shop, the late morning sun warm against the cool ocean breeze coming off the nearby marina. "Not to disrupt his life, not to force anything, just to know my son, if he's willing." Elena considered this request carefully. 13 years of protective instinct warring with a growing recognition that Kai deserved the chance to know his father, especially now that the danger which had originally driven them apart had been fully resolved. "I need to tell him first," she said finally. "Properly, privately, before he meets you. He deserves to process this in his own time, not be blindsided by suddenly meeting a father he's never known." Damien agreed without hesitation, understanding completely the wisdom in her caution, even as every instinct in him longed to meet his son immediately. They agreed that Elena would speak with Kai that evening, explaining as much as she felt he was ready to understand, and that Damien would wait to hear from her before attempting any direct contact. That evening, after dinner, Elena sat down with Kai at their kitchen table, the same table where she had first explained his unusual heritage to him years earlier, and began what would prove to be the most difficult conversation of her life as a mother. She told him, carefully and honestly, about his father, about the circumstances that had forced her to flee before Kai was even born, about the danger that had kept her silent about his father's identity for so many years. Kai listened with the same serious, focused attention he brought to everything important in his life, his expression cycling through shock, confusion, and finally a kind of cautious, overwhelming hope, as the full weight of his mother's explanation settled over him. "He's here," Kai said slowly, once Elena had finished. "In Brookhaven, right now." "Yes," Elena confirmed gently. "He came looking for us, Kai, and he's been searching for 13 years. He didn't even know about you until a few years ago. And once he did, he never stopped trying to find us. Do you want him here?" Kai asked, his gray eyes, so identical to his father's, studying her with an intensity that made Elena's heart ache. "In our life, I mean. Do you want that?" Elena considered the question carefully, aware of how much weight her answer might carry for her son's own feelings about the situation. "I think," she said slowly, "that we both deserve the chance to find out. He's been given a rare second chance most people never get, and so have you, the chance to actually know your father, instead of only wondering about him. I don't want to make that decision for you, though. This is your choice, as much as mine." Kai was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had just learned. 13 years of unanswered questions about his own identity, suddenly finding real, tangible answers. "I want to meet him," he said finally, his voice steady, despite the obvious emotion beneath it. "I've wondered about him my whole life. I want to know who he is." Elena nodded, pulling her son into a tight embrace, both of them holding on to each other as 13 years of careful, protective secrecy gave way to something new, uncertain, but full of genuine possibility. The following weekend, Elena arranged for Kai to meet Damien at a quiet park near their house, a neutral, unhurried setting that would allow father and son to begin building their relationship without the pressure of an overly formal or dramatic first encounter. Damien arrived early, pacing nervously near a park bench, more anxious than he could ever remember feeling in his entire adult life, despite having faced down countless political challenges and dangerous confrontations throughout his years as Alpha King. Nothing had ever compared to the terror and hope tangled together in his chest as he waited to properly meet his son for the very first time. When Elena and Kai finally arrived, walking together across the grass toward where Damien stood waiting, time seemed to slow entirely. Kai studied Damien with careful, searching eyes as they approached, and Damien found himself doing the same, memorizing every detail of the young man standing before him, tall and confident, with Elena's determined chin and his own unmistakable gray eyes. "Kai," Elena said gently, "this is Damien." For a long moment, neither Damien nor Kai spoke, simply studying each other with the careful, cautious attention of two people meeting for the first time, yet already bound by an unbreakable connection neither had chosen, but both now had to navigate. Finally, Damien extended his hand, his voice rough with barely contained emotion. "It's good to finally meet you, Kai. I've imagined this moment for a very long time." Kai studied the offered hand for a moment before shaking it firmly, an easy confidence in the gesture that reminded Damien, painfully and beautifully, of himself at that age. "Mom told me everything," Kai said, "about why you weren't around. I understand it wasn't your choice." "No," Damien agreed quietly. "It wasn't. But I'm here now. If you're willing to let me be part of your life going forward, I won't push for more than you're comfortable with. This is entirely up to you." They spent the next 2 hours walking through the park together, Elena a careful, watchful presence a few steps behind, allowing father and son the space to begin forming their own connection, while remaining close enough to intervene if the emotional weight of the moment became too overwhelming for either of them. Kai asked question after question, curious about pack life, about his heritage, about the father he was only just beginning to know, and Damien answered each one with patient, honest detail, grateful beyond words for every small opportunity to share pieces of himself with the son he had missed for 13 long years. By the time they parted that afternoon, something fragile but genuine had begun to take root between them, the first tentative steps of a relationship neither Damien nor Kai had ever expected to have the chance to build. As Damien watched Elena and Kai walk back toward their car, his heart full in a way he had not experienced in over a decade, he understood clearly that the true work of rebuilding their family was only just beginning, and that whatever challenges still lay ahead, he intended to face every single one of them at their side. News of Damien's discovery traveled quickly through Blackthorn territory once he returned home to formally address his council, and while most pack members reacted with genuine joy at the revelation that their Alpha King had finally found the family he had spent 13 years searching for, not everyone within the council chambers shared that same enthusiasm. Ashford's exile years earlier had scattered his allies throughout the territory, and several of them still held positions of quiet influence. Individuals who had built careers and alliances around the assumption that Blackthorn's future leadership would flow through a politically advantageous marriage, not through an unexpected heir born to a servant girl who had fled the pack over a decade earlier. Foremost among these lingering allies was Lord Corwin Vale, a distant cousin of Ashford's who had inherited much of his network and ambition without ever being directly implicated in the original conspiracy against Elena. Vale had spent years quietly positioning himself as a moderate, reasonable voice on the council, careful never to draw the kind of suspicion that had led to Ashford's downfall, all while patiently waiting for an opportunity to advance his own family's influence within pack politics. Kai's sudden emergence as Damien's legitimate heir threatened everything Vale had spent years carefully building. A true-born son, once formally recognized and claimed, would stand far above any political maneuvering Vale might have hoped to accomplish through more traditional channels, and Vale had no intention of allowing that recognition to proceed unchallenged. The council must consider this situation carefully, Vale argued during an emergency session called shortly after Damien's return, his tone carrying the same practiced reasonableness that had always characterized his public persona. "This boy has spent 13 years raised entirely outside pack traditions, outside our laws, outside any understanding of what it means to be part of Blackthorn. Recognizing him as heir, without proper preparation, without proper vetting, risks destabilizing everything our territory has built." Damien listened to this argument with carefully controlled patience, aware that outright dismissing Vale's concerns without proper response would only fuel further council resistance. Kai is my son, born of a true bond, not a political arrangement. His right to inheritance is not something this council has the authority to simply deny, based on concerns about preparation. We will address whatever education and integration he needs. That is not a reason to reject him. The debate continued for hours, other council members weighing in, with varying degrees of support and hesitation, and while Damien ultimately secured enough backing to move forward with formally beginning the recognition process, he left the session with a clear understanding that Vale, and likely others sympathetic to his position, had not given up their opposition entirely. They had simply retreated to regroup, to search for another angle of attack. That angle emerged sooner than Damien expected, in the form of a carefully orchestrated smear campaign that began circulating quietly through pack channels within weeks of his return. Rumors began spreading, subtle at first, questioning whether Kai's parentage could truly be confirmed without formal verification, suggesting that Elena's years spent living among humans might have compromised whatever pack heritage Kai carried, raising doubts about whether a boy raised entirely outside traditional pack structures could ever truly understand or fulfill the responsibilities of leadership. Damien traced the source of these rumors back, through careful investigation, to individuals closely connected to Vale's network, though Vale himself remained careful never to be directly implicated, always maintaining plausible deniability, while his allies did the more damaging work on his behalf. It was a familiar pattern, one that echoed uncomfortably with the conspiracy Ashford had orchestrated against Elena over a decade earlier, and it filled Damien with a cold, protective fury that he worked hard to keep carefully controlled in his public dealings. Elena and Kai, meanwhile, remained in Brookhaven for the time being, continuing their gradual process of building a relationship with Damien through regular visits and long phone conversations, even as the political complications back at Blackthorn grew increasingly serious. Elena had insisted on this arrangement, unwilling to uproot Kai's entire life, his school, his friendships, his hard-won sense of normalcy, until they had all worked through a careful, deliberate plan for how the transition to pack life might eventually unfold. But that careful timeline was disrupted abruptly one evening, when Silas arrived at Damien's private study with urgent, troubling news. Vale's allies have gone beyond rumors, Silas reported grimly. I've intercepted communications, suggesting they're planning to challenge Kai's legitimacy formally, through a demand for public verification testing, the kind of ritual typically reserved for disputed parentage claims. It's rarely used, and it's designed to be humiliating and invasive. If they succeed in forcing this challenge, it could delay the recognition process indefinitely, possibly for years, while they continue working to undermine support for Kai's claim in the meantime. Damien's jaw tightened at this news, a familiar protective anger rising in his chest. They're targeting a 13-year-old boy who has done nothing except grow up exactly as his mother raised him to, safely and honorably, despite everything Ashford's conspiracy forced upon them both. There's more, Silas continued, his expression grave. I have reason to believe Vale's network may attempt something more direct if the legal challenge doesn't succeed quickly enough. Nothing confirmed yet, but enough concerning chatter that I think Elena and Kai's location should no longer be considered fully secure. This warning sent a fresh wave of urgency through Damien's carefully measured plans. He immediately arranged additional discreet protection for Elena and Kai in Brookhaven, trusted pack members positioned to monitor their safety without revealing themselves or disrupting the ordinary rhythm of their daily lives, while he worked simultaneously to address the political challenge building against them back at Blackthorn. He traveled to Brookhaven himself to deliver this difficult news in person, finding Elena in her kitchen preparing dinner, while Kai finished homework at the same table where, years from now in a different telling of this story, so many important family conversations would continue to take place. Elena's face paled as Damien explained the situation carefully, watching old fears resurface in her expression. Fears she had believed 13 years of careful hiding had finally allowed her to leave behind. I thought this was over, she said quietly, once Kai had been sent to his room to give the adults privacy for the more difficult parts of the conversation. I thought Ashford's exile meant we were finally safe. Ashford is gone, Damien confirmed, but apparently his ambitions didn't die with his exile. I promise you, Elena, I will handle this. I won't let history repeat itself. But I need you to trust me, and I need us to work together to protect Kai through whatever comes next. Elena studied him for a long moment, 13 years of hard-won independence, warring with a growing recognition that this particular threat required resources and political standing she simply did not possess on her own. "What do you need from us?" "For now, additional caution," Damien said. "I have people watching over you both, discreetly, and I need to move forward with the formal recognition process more quickly than I originally planned, before Vale's allies can build enough momentum to seriously delay things. That means, eventually, bringing Kai to Blackthorn for a proper introduction to the pack and council." Elena's protective instincts flared immediately at this suggestion. "He's 13 years old, Damien. Uprooting him now, thrusting him into pack politics before he's had any real time to adjust to even the basic truth of his heritage. That terrifies me." "I understand," Damien said gently, reaching for her hand across the table. "And I would never ask this if I saw any safer alternative. But the longer this recognition process remains unresolved, the more opportunity Vale's allies have to cause real damage, not just politically, but potentially to Kai's actual safety. I think, as difficult as it is, moving forward now protects him better than waiting." Elena closed her eyes for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her with familiar, exhausting intensity. She had spent 13 years making every difficult choice alone, and now, for the first time, she had a partner in this impossible situation. Someone equally invested in protecting their son, even if his approach came from a position of political power she had never possessed. "Let me talk to Kai," she said finally. "This has to be his decision too, as much as it can be at his age. He deserves to understand what's happening and have some say in how we move forward." Damien agreed immediately, and that evening, the three of them sat together at the kitchen table. Elena and Damien, explaining the situation as clearly and honestly as possible to Kai, who listened with the same serious, thoughtful attention he had shown throughout every difficult conversation about his heritage over the past several years. "So there are people trying to say I'm not really your son," Kai said slowly, once his parents had finished explaining, "just because they don't want me to become the next Alpha King someday." "Essentially, yes," Damien confirmed, impressed, despite the gravity of the situation, by his son's clear, direct grasp of the political complexity involved. Kai considered this for a long moment, his young face settling into an expression of quiet, determined resolve that reminded both his parents, in different ways, of themselves. "Then let's prove them wrong," he said finally. "I'm not scared of some council members who don't even know me. If this is who I really am, I want to understand it properly, not hide from it." Elena felt a swell of pride and fear tangle together in her chest as she listened to her son's brave declaration. 13 years of careful protection, culminating in this moment where Kai, on the verge of stepping into a world far larger and more complicated than anything he had known, chose courage over caution. She exchanged a long look with Damien across the table, both of them understanding without words that whatever came next, they would face it together, as the family circumstances had once denied them the chance to be. The journey to Blackthorn territory felt surreal to Kai, watching the landscape shift outside the car window from familiar coastal towns to increasingly dense forest, the same winding roads his mother had once traveled in reverse 13 years earlier, fleeing everything that now waited to formally welcome him home. Elena sat beside him in the back seat, her hand resting reassuringly over his, while Damien drove them personally, rather than relying on pack drivers, wanting this particular journey to be as private and unhurried as possible given everything riding on it. They arrived at the Blackthorn compound on a clear afternoon, and Kai found himself staring in quiet wonder at the imposing stone architecture rising from the surrounding forest, the same buildings where his mother had once worked in the kitchens, where his parents had first fallen in love, where the conspiracy that had shaped his entire early life had originally taken root. It was strange, he thought, standing at the entrance to a world that was simultaneously entirely foreign and somehow, in some instinctive way he could not fully articulate, deeply familiar. Damien had arranged for their arrival to be relatively low-key, wanting Kai to have some time to adjust to his surroundings before the more formal and public recognition proceedings began. But word traveled quickly through any pack community, and by the time they had settled into the private quarters Damien had prepared for them, curious pack members had already begun gathering in small clusters throughout the compound. eager for even a brief glimpse of the long-lost heir, whose story had captivated Blackthorn territory for weeks. The formal recognition ceremony was scheduled for 3 days after their arrival, giving Kai a brief window to begin adjusting to pack customs and traditions under Damien's careful guidance, while Silas and other trusted allies worked simultaneously to counter the ongoing political challenges still being orchestrated by Vale's network. It was, Damien acknowledged privately to Elena, an imperfect timeline, rushed by necessity rather than choice, but the alternative, allowing Vale's opposition additional time to build momentum, posed a far greater risk to their family's long-term safety and stability. On the second evening of their stay, as Kai was beginning to settle into the unfamiliar rhythms of pack life, Vale made his boldest move yet, formally submitting his demand for verification testing before the full council, framing it not as a personal attack, but as a necessary, reasonable procedural safeguard that any responsible governing body would insist upon before confirming so significant a claim to succession. This is not about doubting the Alpha King's honesty, Vale argued smoothly before the assembled council, his tone carrying the same practiced reasonableness he always employed. It is about ensuring the stability and legitimacy of our succession for generations to come. Surely no one objects to a straightforward verification process, unless there is something to hide. Damien felt the trap embedded within Vale's carefully worded challenge immediately. Refusing the verification would appear suspicious, feeding exactly the doubts Vale's network had spent weeks quietly cultivating throughout the pack. Accepting it meant subjecting Kai, still adjusting to the most disorienting weeks of his young life, to an invasive, humiliating ritual designed more to unsettle and delay than to genuinely confirm anything already plainly evident to anyone who looked at the boy's unmistakable eyes. "My son's parentage is not in question," Damien said firmly, his voice carrying clearly through the council chamber. "But if this council requires formal verification to satisfy procedural concerns, we will proceed, on the condition that it happens swiftly, professionally, and without further unnecessary delay or public spectacle." Vale's expression flickered with poorly concealed satisfaction at securing even this partial victory, having successfully forced a delay and a moment of public scrutiny that he clearly hoped might yet unearth some complication he could exploit. The council agreed to schedule the verification for the following morning, a relatively simple procedure involving a pack healer skilled in reading bloodline markers that ran deeper than mere physical resemblance, an ancient tradition, older than written pack law itself. Elena was furious when she learned of the demand, her protective instincts flaring sharply at the idea of her son being subjected to any kind of test, however routine council members claimed it to be. "He's already been through so much upheaval in these past few weeks," she said to Damien that evening, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Now they want to parade him in front of the entire council, like he's a suspect who needs to prove his own existence." "I know," Damien said quietly, sharing her frustration completely, even as he understood the political necessity of proceeding calmly. "I wish I could spare him this, but refusing would only give Vale exactly the ammunition he's hoping for. The fastest way through this is simply to complete the verification and remove any remaining excuse for further delay." When Elena explained the situation to Kai that night, bracing herself for fear or anger at the unfair scrutiny being directed at him, she found instead a calm, steady resolve that both surprised and moved her deeply. "It's fine, Mom," Kai said simply. "If proving who I am makes this go faster and stops people from causing trouble for you and Dad, then let's just do it. I know who I am. I'm not worried about some test proving that." The verification the following morning proceeded exactly as Damien had predicted, the pack healer confirming within minutes, before the assembled council, that Kai's bloodline markers matched Damien's own, with absolute, undeniable certainty. Vale's expression remained carefully neutral throughout the proceedings, but Damien did not miss the brief flicker of frustration that crossed his features when the healer's confirmation left no possible room for further doubt or delay. But Vale, having invested so much political capital into his opposition, was not yet ready to fully concede defeat. As the council session concluded, he requested one final moment to address the assembly, and Damien, unable to reasonably deny him this without appearing to suppress legitimate council process, allowed him to speak. "The verification confirms parentage," Vale said carefully, But parentage alone has never been the sole standard for succession in Blackthorn history. This boy has spent his entire life outside pack society, raised by a mother who fled our territory, rather than face our laws directly. I ask this council to consider whether 13 years of separation from our traditions can truly be overcome by a few weeks of hurried preparation before formal recognition. A murmur rippled through the assembled council at this new line of argument, and Damien felt a fresh surge of protective anger rising in his chest as he watched Kai, seated beside Elena in the gallery, absorb this latest challenge to his legitimacy with visible tension, despite his earlier calm resolve. Before Damien could respond, however, Kai rose from his seat, his young voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent chamber. "May I speak?" he asked, addressing the council directly with a composure that seemed to startle even the most skeptical members present. Damien exchanged a quick, surprised glance with Elena before nodding his permission, curious, and, despite his protective instincts, genuinely proud of his son's evident courage. Kai stepped forward, standing before the full council, with his shoulders squared, his gray eyes, so unmistakably his father's, meeting Vale's gaze directly without flinching. "You're right that I grew up outside pack traditions," Kai said clearly. "And you're right that I have a lot to learn about what it means to be part of this world. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But my mother raised me to work hard, to be honest, and to face challenges directly instead of running from them. She kept me safe for 13 years, alone, with no help from this council, because someone within these walls decided my life wasn't worth the political inconvenience it might have caused. If anyone here doubts my commitment to learning what it means to lead this pack responsibly, I'm asking for the chance to prove that commitment through my actions, not through assumptions made before I've even had the opportunity to show what I'm capable of." The council chamber fell into a heavy, considering silence following Kai's unexpected address, several members exchanging thoughtful glances, clearly moved by the boy's evident sincerity and composure despite his young age. Even Vale, for a brief moment, appeared to struggle for an adequate response, his carefully constructed argument suddenly less convincing in the face of Kai's direct, dignified appeal. It was an older council member, one who had remained largely neutral throughout the entire proceedings, who finally broke the silence. "I move that we formally accept the verification results and proceed with the recognition ceremony as originally scheduled, with the understanding that the Alpha King will ensure his heir receives appropriate preparation and guidance in the months ahead." The motion passed with a clear majority, Vale's remaining objections overwhelmed by the shifted mood within the chamber, and as the council session finally concluded, Damien crossed the room to pull his son into a tight, proud embrace, unable to fully express in words how deeply moved he was by Kai's courage and composure in the face of such difficult, unwarranted scrutiny. "You didn't need to defend yourself alone," Damien said quietly. "I would have spoken for you." "I know," Kai said, "but I needed them to hear it from me. I needed to show them who I really am, not just let them argue about me like I wasn't even standing right there." Elena, watching this exchange with tears in her eyes, felt something settle deeply within her chest, a recognition that the son she had raised alone for 13 years, through fear and hardship and constant careful vigilance, had grown into exactly the kind of person capable of navigating even this daunting, unfamiliar world with grace and genuine strength. Whatever challenges still remained ahead, she understood in that moment that Kai would face them, not as a frightened boy, thrust unwillingly into an unfamiliar destiny, but as a young man fully capable of claiming his place in it, on his own carefully earned terms. The formal recognition ceremony took place 3 weeks later, on a clear morning beneath the wide-open sky above Blackthorn's central gathering grounds, where hundreds of pack members assembled to witness a moment that would have seemed impossible only a few months earlier. Elena stood near the front of the crowd, dressed simply but elegantly in a deep blue gown Damien had insisted on having made for her, watching with a heart full of emotion as her son prepared to step into a legacy that had once nearly cost him his life before he was even born. Vale had, in the weeks following the council session, quietly withdrawn most of his remaining opposition, recognizing that public sentiment had shifted decisively against his position, following Kai's composed and courageous address to the council. He attended the ceremony that morning alongside the rest of the assembled pack, his expression carefully neutral, And while Damien remained watchful of any lingering influence Vale might still hold, the most immediate danger to Kai's recognition had, for now, been successfully navigated. The ceremony itself followed ancient Blackthorn tradition, a series of formal declarations and symbolic gestures that connected each new heir to the long line of leadership that had come before him. Damien stood at the center of the gathering grounds, Kai beside him, as the pack's eldest healer recited the traditional words of recognition, her voice carrying clearly across the silent, attentive crowd. By blood confirmed, by courage proven, by the will of the Alpha King, this pack recognizes Kai Blackthorn as true-born heir to the territory and leadership of this pack, entitled to all rights, responsibilities, and protections such recognition carries. A collective murmur of approval rippled through the assembled crowd as the healer completed the traditional declaration, many pack members already having heard the story of Kai's courageous stand before the council weeks earlier, a story that had spread quickly throughout the territory and earned him considerable goodwill, even among those who had initially harbored doubts about his readiness for such a significant role. Damien turned to face his son fully, placing both hands on Kai's shoulders in the traditional gesture of formal acknowledgement between an Alpha King and his recognized heir. 13 years ago, Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering grounds, though the words were meant, in their deepest sense, only for his son. I lost something precious, without ever knowing what I had lost. Today, I have it back, and I could not be more proud of the young man you have become, despite everything working against you. Welcome home, Kai. Kai, his gray eyes bright with emotion he made no effort to hide, embraced his father fully in front of the assembled crowd, a moment of genuine, unguarded connection that drew warm applause from the watching pack members. Elena, watching from the front row, felt tears sliding freely down her face. 13 years of fear, sacrifice, and careful protection, finally giving way to something she had almost forgotten how to fully believe in. Genuine, uncomplicated peace. Following the formal recognition, Damien addressed the crowd once more, and this time, his words turned toward Elena directly, a development she had not fully anticipated, despite the weeks of careful planning that had gone into this significant day. There is one more matter this pack must address today, Damien said, his gaze finding Elena's across the gathering grounds. 13 years ago, this territory failed a woman who deserved better, who was forced to flee everything she knew to protect our son from a danger this council allowed to take root within its own walls. I cannot undo those years of hardship she faced alone, but I can, and will, formally acknowledge what should have been recognized from the very beginning. He extended his hand toward her, and Elena, her heart pounding with a mixture of surprise and overwhelming emotion, made her way through the parting crowd to stand beside him at the center of the gathering grounds. Damien took her hand gently in his own, addressing the assembled pack once more. Elena is my true mate, bonded to me not through political arrangement, but through genuine, unbreakable connection. I ask this council and this pack to formally recognize her place beside me, as she should have been recognized from the very start, had circumstances not conspired so cruelly against her. The pack's response was immediate and overwhelming, warm applause and approving murmurs sweeping through the gathering grounds as the healer stepped forward once more to perform the formal bonding recognition, an honor Elena had once believed, during her darkest and most frightened years alone, she would never have the chance to claim. She looked into Damien's eyes as the healer spoke the traditional words binding them formally before the pack, and for the first time in 13 years, she allowed herself to fully believe that the fear and hiding were truly, finally behind her. In the months that followed the ceremony, Elena and Kai settled gradually into their new life at Blackthorn, a transition that came with its own share of challenges and adjustments, but which neither of them approached with anything less than genuine determination. Kai threw himself into learning pack traditions and history with the same intense focus he had always brought to everything important in his life, quickly earning respect among younger pack members for both his natural leadership qualities and his evident humility, despite his significant new status. Elena, for her part, found unexpected purpose in using her years of accounting and business experience to help modernize several aspects of Blackthorn's territorial management, work that earned her genuine respect from council members who had once viewed her only through the lens of old political scandal and controversy. She remained close with Grace, arranging regular visits between Blackthorn and Ellsworth, ensuring that the woman who had shown her such crucial kindness during her most difficult years would always remain a cherished part of their extended family. Vale, having lost most of his political influence following the failed opposition campaign, gradually faded into a diminished role within council affairs, never formally punished for his actions but effectively sidelined by a pack that had, through Kai's courage and Damien's steady leadership, largely moved past the old political games that had once nearly destroyed their family before it had even fully formed. 1 year after the formal recognition ceremony, on a quiet evening in early autumn, Elena stood on the same balcony where Damien had once spent countless lonely nights, staring out at a moonless sky, wondering if he would ever find the family he had lost. Now, Damien stood beside her, his arm wrapped securely around her shoulders, while inside their private chambers, Kai's laughter carried through an open window as he shared stories from his day with a few of the younger pack members he had grown close to over the past year. "Do you ever think about how differently everything could have turned out?" Elena asked quietly, leaning into Damien's warmth as the last light of sunset faded into deepening twilight. "If you hadn't kept searching all those years?" "Every day," Damien admitted, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "But I never stopped believing I would find you both, even when everyone around me thought I should give up and move forward with my life. Something in me always knew you were out there, that our son was out there, waiting for the day our paths would finally cross again." Elena smiled, turning to look up at him with the same warmth and love that had first drawn them together so many years earlier, now tempered and deepened by everything they had endured separately to finally arrive at this moment together. 13 years is a long time to wait," she said softly. "It was worth every single day," Damien replied, "because it led me here, to you, and to the son who makes me prouder, every single day than I ever imagined possible." Below them, in the courtyard, Kai's laughter rang out once more, warm and unburdened, the sound of a young man who had finally found not only his true home, but the family he had always deserved, safe now, together, with nothing left to hide from, and nowhere left to run. The long years of fear and separation had finally given way to something neither Elena nor Damien had dared to fully hope for during their darkest, loneliest years apart. A family whole again, standing together, ready to face whatever future still lay ahead of them, this time, as one.